Our next founder is Robert Goldsborough. Now, I have written about Robert Goldsborough in the past. This time I'm focusing specifically on a letter he wrote to George Washington. But to recap, Robert Goldsborough was educated in the Americas and in England and practiced law in London as well as the colonies. He was from Maryland, where he became one of the most successful lawyers and so important to the local colonial government that when the First Continental Congress was called, he was elected to go. Now, he doesn't go. I could never figure out why he doesn't go, but he doesn't go to the First Continental Congress, and therefore does not sign the Continental Association. Miss signing number 1. He then is elected to go to the Second Continental Congress, and he does go to the Second Continental Congress for a little while. And then, just before independence is voted on, probably because he sees independence coming, as several founders did. They saw independence coming and wanted to go back to their home state where they thought the real important work was. He leaves about 2 months before the Declaration of Independence is voted on and 3 months before it's signed. Missed signing number 2. He goes back to private life for a while and then eventually, in 1787, is elected by Maryland to go to the Constitutional Convention. Sadly, he has a bit of ill health and he doesn't go. Missed signing number 3. Robert Goldsborough should have signed 3 of the 4 major documents of the American Revolution, and sadly for him, signed none, pretty much just by chance. That's okay, we'll forgive him. Now, he was, like I said, real sick. In fact, after the Constitution was written, Goldsborough would be elected to the Maryland Ratification Convention, and he would skip that also and die just a few weeks later, because he was very, very sick. That being said, Goldsborough knew the weight of the Constitutional Convention, and he sent a letter to George Washington. In fact, he addresses the letter to His Excellency George Washington, President of the Convention in Philadelphia. Now, at this point, Goldsborough had never actually met Washington, so he doesn't actually send it under his name. He sends it at his pseudonym he uses is the author, and he actually sends with this addressed to Washington, he sends a letter that essentially says, my name, you don't know me, and that's why I'm sending this anonymously, but more or less says, I'm supposed to be there with you, but since I can't be, here is what I'm thinking. And, it's a very polite letter as it was at the time, but he essentially writes out his idea of what the government should be. Now, although he doesn't sign any documents, he was a former Continental Congressman and one of the most respected legal minds in Maryland. So it's really interesting to take a look at the government he outlines in just a few paragraphs. Essentially, his plan of government, and I did it really brief in my article, I'm going to do it really brief now, but he promotes the idea of a federal government. But much like we discussed when we were talking about Brutus the last handful of weeks, he wanted to make sure the limits on each branch were very specifically defined. As for the Continental Congress, he wants to keep that essentially the same. The way it's elected, the way it operates, that should be continued more or less the same, giving really the power to the states to choose delegates to the Congress, the federal Congress, as they liked, which again would really put the hands and the power of the hands in the states. But he did want to treat it like a real government, because the Continental Congress really only had a legislative branch. There was no judicial branch, and there was no executive branch, and everyone living at that time agreed that a real government would have all 3 branches. So although Continental Congress and the legislative branch remain pretty much the same, Goldsborough talks about creating an executive. Now, again, everyone knew they were meeting to change the Articles of Confederation, and some people wanted more changes, some people wanted less, and the Continental Congress met in secret. They were just known as the Philadelphia Convention at the time. They didn't know the Constitutional Convention. They were just called the Philadelphia Convention because they didn't know they were writing a whole new constitution at that point. But the eyes of the world were on what was happening there. If not the world, at least the United States were on what was happening in Philadelphia, because who knows what was coming out? Who knows what kind of improvements these chosen leaders could create? Goldsborough writes that he wants there to be what he called a governor. Now, another side note here. We have a president of the United States of America, but that could have easily been a governor, because each state at the time, most states had governors, like now. Some states, like Delaware and Pennsylvania, had presidents. Those words were essentially interchangeable. So when he's talking about the president of the United States, Goldsborough actually uses the word governor, which it's just really interesting to reflect. that they, if Governor Morris wrote the word governor instead of president, we'd have governor of the United, Governor Joe Biden right now. And it would seem natural to us and not strange at all. I just thought that was a funny side note. Either way, he's running governor, but he's talking about president. And he says that there should be one person elected for 1 year term by the Continental Congress. And there should be a cabinet of 13 members who are chosen, I believe, by the states. He does, a few of the things he says a little bit contradict themselves, but again, he's not writing a constitution by himself. He's just laying out ideas for George Washington. But it seems like he wants the separate states, each state, to choose its own cabinet member to work in the executive branch, and a quorum, 2/3 vote of the cabinet members coupled with the president's decision would make any executive decisions. He did think there should be the ability to raise an army, though he doesn't necessarily say there should be a standing army, but he does say you need to be able to enforce the laws created by the Continental Congress or the legislature, same thing. You need an executive to enforce those things. And so you really need that. And he thought that doing it with an elected cabinet of 13, one from each state, and the president with a 1 year term chosen by the Congress, not from Continental Congress, that is a change. The Continental Congress would choose its own president, because president at the time was associated as like a chairman, and a governor was more of someone who led a state. In fact, that is one of the reasons that they go with the word president instead of governor, is governor seemed too powerful, and president, you're working for us, essentially, with the idea of that, the propaganda behind choosing the word president. Goldsborough doesn't really dive too deep into that. He does, however, move on to the judicial branch. And he does think there should be a judicial branch. It is not so much like today's Supreme Court. It has a lot of the same ideas, chosen for life, things of that nature. But there are limitations to it. They really only decide on arguments between states, and then between states or the United States and foreign nations and the Native Americans. That is really all he thought the judicial system should do. I want to reference back to Brutus. One of the major complaints of the essays of Brutus and many anti-federalists, once the Constitution is written, is things are too loosely defined. The necessary and proper clause, like, what do you mean necessary and proper? Anything's necessary and proper. I could say, I need you to light your hair on fire. It's necessary and proper for me to eat this bag of Cheetos. Now, that doesn't make any sense, but you could say it, right? And that is one of the major arguments of many anti-federalists after the Constitution is published. They want things to be very specifically what can this government do and what can it not do. We should define this very specifically. And Goldsborough actually sits on that a lot. And it's a really interesting perspective. A person who's writing in June of 1787 as the Constitutional Convention is going underway, someone who wants a stronger federal government, saying we need to add a president, we need to add a judicial system, we need to make it like a real government. Also, at the same time, taking what would just 6 months later be an anti-federalist position of it needs to be very specifically defined. Nothing can be done flippantly. Nothing can just be out there in the ether. As I said, as for Goldsborough, I found this very interesting. I just found this as a very interesting letter, and its reflection on the ideas passing through not just Maryland, but all of the different states by all the different people at the time of the writing of the United States Constitution. As I said, unfortunately for Goldsborough, he would pass away from the same disease that kept him from the Constitutional Convention just a year later, and making it so he couldn't even attend the ratification convention. But that's a brief overview of the author, Robert Goldsborough, who wrote anonymously to George Washington about what he thought a federal government should look like.